lovers. I'm Coach Bo, and this is Sexy Times Storytime, my exploration of desire, pleasure, intimacy, satisfaction, and love, especially but not exclusively for those of us who are neurospicy. And today's episode, as it turns out, is definitely one of those that's especially for those of us who are neurospicy. The question I want to talk about today is if neurodivergent people are bad at relationships, what does a functioning relationship for people who are neurodiverse look like? Now, by the way, I don't actually believe that people who are neurodivergent are bad at relationships, but I do recognize and have discussed, I think, in other reels on other platforms in the past, how I feel like shows like Big Bang Theory, for example, created a situation where we have a specific idea of what neurodiversity, in particular autism and ADHD, look like in the wild. Often the view that we have of that is also of straight white men who are incapable of close relationships, oblivious to social cues, etc. I think that that is honestly largely untrue, even for the straight white guys. And I'll tell you why. Firstly, one, we're not all the same, so it would be impossible for us to all be the same. And I think this is particularly important to me because when we think about popular narratives, for example, about hiring autistic people in the workplace, it's always because they're more techie or they're going to be better somehow at technical knowledge, etc. And as a person who is autistic, like, sure, I like the details, but to be honest, I much prefer conceptual thinking, conceptual thought, which is something that I'm not supposed to prefer as someone who's autistic. And I would be really upset, to be honest, if you put me in a room with some Excels, closed the door, and told me to get on with it, right? Very different reaction if you put me in a room with some PowerPoints or some Word documents and told me to get on with storytelling or otherwise creating narratives. That would actually be my dream. But the point is, not all of us are the same. The second thing, which I think is worth pointing out, is that in a lot of these popular narratives about what it's like to be neurodiverse, or in particular be in a relationship with someone's neurodiversity, we are always the problem. It is always, oh my goodness, you are such a good person for putting up with that autism, ADHD, chaos, inappropriateness, whatever it might be. And the other person is almost portrayed as a saint for doing that. And I think that's also, to be honest, in line with a lot of other disabilities. I know many people who have ADHD do not consider that a disability. I personally do, not because I feel that I'm somehow inferior to others. I'm not making a value statement about myself. All I'm saying is that the environment that I'm in very often disables me rather than there be something wrong with me. There is something wrong with society, and it is what it is. But I also believe that no one's doing me a favor, nor are they exhibiting some supernatural awareness, love, altruism by being in a relationship with me. Because a lot of the time, to be honest, I also believe, third thing, that people who are neurodivergent might be better at relationships than people who are neurotypical. The only reason is that you grow up with your whole life feeling other. You feel like the way that you think does not make sense for other people. People are trying to talk to you about very basic concepts, and you are seemingly oblivious to how they work out. My example is always kind of studying at university. It was a very awkward situation because it turns out I never actually learned how to study. I just kind of like the night before, look at the documents really hard, try to memorize what the page looked like, and then read off the page in the exam the next day, which is like not a good method for studying. But people kept on saying, well, you're doing reasonably well, so like it must be fine. And I was like, do you know that I have to sit in the front row of all my lectures just to prevent myself from falling asleep? That's not because I'm being disrespectful to the lecture. It's not even because I'm not interested. I just physically cannot stay awake. And I was unmedicated in that time, so I had no idea. And can I tell you how awkward it is when you fall asleep at someone's wedding? Can I tell you how awkward it is when you are yawning at your own wedding? Those kind of things are multiple situations in which it feels inappropriate to be responding how I'm responding, but I don't have a choice about it. And those kind of situations have also made me acutely aware of there are a bunch of basic things which, for whatever reason, are difficult for me. That awareness has made me much more able and much more willing to accommodate others. And so I often am in uncomfortable situations where I accept that I'm in an uncomfortable situation because I sort of assume I'm clearly the problem here. This person is neurotypical. they're probably doing what is socially accepted in this moment. I should take a cue from them, right? Or if I'm uncomfortable, it's because of my own neurodiversity. It's not really something that they're doing to me. I've kind of grown out of that in a lot of ways, but I think it's still something that applies very much for people who are neurodivergent, especially because we have to do so much masking and pretending. It really is quite a lot of work to be consciously thinking about, am I smiling? Am I talking too fast? Am I interrupting too much? Did I not make eye contact? This meta kind of narrative that's going on in your mind in every interaction with every person is kind of difficult to maintain, and it does require some ability to empathize with others and understand what will be comfortable for them, some ability to recognize their emotions, emotional states, level of comfort, etc., which requires some EQ. And a person who places that much emphasis on making the people around them feel comfortable, maybe it's people pleasery, maybe it's a trauma response, but nonetheless, I find it very difficult to believe that all those people would be bad at relationships or useless at relationships. Nonetheless, setting all of those problematic assumptions aside, let's pretend for a moment that neurodivergent people are bad at relationships or bad at adulting. What would then constitute a functional relationship for those people? I say those people, but I mean for my people. I also, by the way, I know people keep on telling me to watch Love on the Spectrum and stuff. I'm sure it's a fantastic show. I don't really want to watch it because I don't think that there's any theater or any entertainment in watching people like me kind of be exploited in the commercial sense for what is essentially just their difference, right? And for it to be a spectacle, something that's very human, very normal, it would be the equivalent for me of just like recording random people's dates and then doing interviews with their family about their first dates and whatever. Like, I guess there's a TV show that's like that, but that's usually about putting them in a particular situation. Maybe it's a crush that you didn't know about. Maybe it's a first dating you're a teenager. Like there's always kind of a spin to it. And I'm just not sure that a disability isn't a sufficient spin for me personally. So I have no idea what any of those things look like. Um, but I will tell a story from my own life. And this is the time that I fell in love at first sight. I did not believe that this was a thing that was possible because, to be honest, I'm a fairly rational person. I'm really an analytical person, and I'm also a very realistic person. I don't like the idea of getting swept away by love and romance and feelings, etc. Not even because I'm not a romantic. It's just like, I don't really see how you could do that and still have an awareness of what human beings are actually like because we're all a little bit like trash. Um, and so for me, I kind of go into dating situations with not a lot of idealism, let's say, in the situation. Now, this particular situation was quite interesting because I had agreed to meet with a man who had bounced and kind of flaked on me twice before. And I kind of agreed to go into this date because I was a bit like, look, I'm going to get a free drink out of it. Like, if it's terrible, I'm in a good part of London that I like anyway. I'll just go there. And I went to this bar, pub, whatever, and saw this man and immediately was like, oh dear, I love you. What is happening here? And we had the most interesting first date ever, which was like a 16-hour first date, which was like all over the city, like to his, to mine, like crazy stuff. And then our second date was also super interesting because at the end of it, he just moved in. We didn't have a conversation about it. He just kind of had his stuff there and then never left. And other people in my life were very much like, are you sure he's not like unhoused? Like, you sure this dude is not like squatting in your house? And I was like, no. But the reality is, honestly, like, I didn't care. Like, we didn't have to have a conversation about it because we were so in sync that it just sort of made sense. And the reasons why I think this was kind of a functional relationship, despite the fact that it was like literally overnight love, is, you know, at the core of it, there was very much a no bullshit, no games kind of mentality, which sort of went like, there is a dating game that we're supposed to play with each other where we pretend that we're not interested and maybe I'm a bit interested and like, oh, I'm not feeling anxious about this at all because, and we both just went like, we're not doing that. And so he was the one who said, I love you first, which by the way, works in many other situations. It's well known that men have a higher propensity to fall in love first and to say, I love you first. Um, but he said it at the end of our first date, and it was very much like, that's very awkward. And he's like, yes, that is awkward. I don't really want to be feeling that. And I was like, yes, it is particularly awkward for me because I share those same unhelpful feelings. And we both agreed it was completely unhinged, but like, you feel what you feel, what's happening is happening. And immediately decided, like, okay, so we're like together now. Okay, awesome. Let's like go onto our phones right now, message all the people we've been seeing, go, thank you so much for your investment and time in me. Unfortunately, I'm now unavailable for continued sexual relations with you because I found the love of my life. So, it is what it is. And that was an awkward text to send to people because I genuinely believed it. And again, it just sounded completely unhinged, especially to be saying that on the first date. But that was what was happening. And certainly the relationship was interesting for me for a number of reasons. One, I never really experienced that level of passion. I always thought that the kind of things people were talking about in love stories, in love songs, etc., were always an exaggeration and something which they had decided had existed post the fact, or something that they needed to believe because that's the thing that kind of sustains society and allows us to procreate and continue and whatever. I was one of those people who totally believed that romantic love was a function of culture rather than a function of neurology. I now understand that love is not an emotion. It very much is a drive. It's a very human drive. It sits in the brain and activates a part of the brain that sits very close to our desire for, hunger, like our desire for food and our drive, for, when it comes to food and feeding ourselves. So it is a very fundamental, basic human thing. But at the time, I'm not sure I fully believed that. And this relationship was interesting for challenging some of those assumptions and being the first time where I felt completely secure and safe in a relationship because the other person did not need any kind of negotiation or any kind of trying to convince them that I was the person for them. He basically was just like, yeah, you're it, let's go. You're cool with that. I also found that the sex and the sexual chemistry between us was incredible in a way that I hadn't really experienced before, despite having been in a long-term relationship and married for almost a decade before this. I just had, for whatever reason, chosen a very stable, secure, low risk, low adventure lifestyle, which allowed me to build my career, to buy a house, to think about having kids, which I never did, but all of those things. And this situation really showed me what it was like to be in a situation where you can't sit next to each other on the sofa for too long because it will immediately result in you having all your clothes off. So that was very fun. There was also the case of finding an intellectual soulmate as well and being able to have the kind of conversations which often are socially unacceptable because they almost verge on being combative, but you're not trying to be combative. You're literally just exploring ideas that you both have, that you both think are interesting, that you both are excited and entertained by. And some of those topics are super controversial. And a lot of the time, I find that when I discuss with people, they get quite emotional and quite attached to their ideas. I am not particularly attached to my ideas and I'm not particularly emotional about them. I take joy in just intellectualization for the sake of intellectualization. And I found that he did the same. And so, in terms of being a sexual soulmate and an intellectual soulmate, 100%. There was also a really lot of clear communications on most topics because we were both neurodivergent, though at the time neither of us knew it. I believe that it meant that we were unwilling to live in the ambiguity and the discomfort of not knowing, right? That's one of the most awkward times in a relationship is where you're trying to figure out what does this person really think about me? What do they really want from their lives, et cetera, et cetera. And we were very good at just being like, this is what I think of you in this moment. This is how you are impacting me in this moment. Please continue or cease doing the thing that you're doing. And that really took the guesswork out of relationships for me in a way that I loved. It's something which later on I realized is a very autistic trait, and maybe one of the reasons why there is so much kink in the autistic community or autistic people in the kink community, largely because a lot of kink is very well structured. It's very clear what you're doing, why you're doing it, when you should stop, when you should start, what this will mean, what this will mean, what will happen afterwards. Like those contracts are made so clear and so explicit for safety reasons. And, also because like if you want to have a good time, it's very hard to do that if you are imagining that you have no idea what's going to happen, etc., in a situation that might be risky or unusual or, honestly, like a little bit weird. Like you want to have all of those details up front. And that's what we did in our relationship. Um, I think that this was functioning for those reasons that we had great communication. We were very happy to be together at all times. We were very happy to be alone for large periods of time. So it was fun being intellectually matched in the sense that we could do a lot of parallel play and a lot of body doubling. So he was a writer, I was a writer, very easy for me to go and write in one room while he was writing in another room, do that for 7 hours uninterrupted, and then come together, have a lovely conversation, etc., and have that be totally fine as time that we spent together but apart. Similarly, if I had something that I really needed to get done, it was lovely to have a person who was around who knew I don't need you to disturb me. I don't need you to feed into this. I do not need to join problem solve with you. I just need your body to physically be there so that I actually get stuff done. I think it was also good from a regulation perspective and just kind of an executive functioning perspective, because it was great having a person who understood that like things like doing the shopping and washing the dishes, etc., are never going to be my forte. So let's figure out a way to do it together so that we can make it fun, so we can make it efficient, and so that we can get it done. And that was super helpful to be able to share that load pretty equally, to be honest, in terms of domestic responsibilities, which often get put into kind of a gender-based role where like women are doing cooking, cleaning, nurturing domestic things, and men are going out and making money. We had exactly the opposite dynamic in the sense because I was the one who was kind of working at the time. He was a PhD student. And so he was the one who was cooking meals, etc., etc. And I could, of course, feed into that and balance that out, but it created much more equality in our relationship. There were a couple of things, though, that I learned about this situation. One, even though it was functional, doesn't mean it was the right fit for us, right? I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I think that in my mind, a relationship was going to work based on how hard I worked at it. So if I just worked harder, if I just denied more of myself, if I just masked more, the relationship would work out. That's a completely selfish and kind of unhinged way to look at the world, because it implies the other person you're with doesn't have any agency and what they do doesn't matter because you're just going to make it work regardless. But this is the kind of like, perfectionist child trauma, whatever thing that many of us have to deal with. And genuinely was my view of the world. And this relationship was very good at showing me that you can be functional and get what you want and still not be able to make it work. Luckily, I don't think that success is measured by longevity. I don't think that being together for a long time means that the relationship was more successful or that breaking up means that you failed. Because the reality was, we didn't have to break up. It's just a choice that I made because I was very much like, I've gotten what I can get from this relationship. I've learned what I can learn from this relationship. It's comfortable to continue, but it's not ultimately aligned with what I want. And that was also a very difficult realization because what I wanted was someone who was going to work as hard as I was going to work on that relationship. And he was not into working on the relationship. He was really excited that it just worked by itself and assumed that would continue. Whereas in my mind, I knew romantic love seldom lasts longer than 6 months. You're lucky if it lasts, 2 years. You have to have a deep attachment beyond that to keep it going. And sexual desire by itself does not build the kind of intimacy that you need for real satisfaction. So, problematic. We were together for a little bit over 6 months, though, which every time I tell people that, that seems to be their way of going like, okay, so I guess it was legit love at first sight. But I think even if we'd been together a week, it wouldn't have made a difference. For me, it would have been just as legitimate. But three things that I think are particularly important when you find yourself in a relationship with someone who is also neurodiverse. One is that your values matter, and your values are not your personality in the same way as your neurodivergence is not your personality. You can't turn them on and off. You care about what you care about. Your values are your values. For me, my top three values are autonomy, in the sense of like freedom and independence, creativity, and kindness. And two of those three were absolutely met in this relationship. But it was really tough to get all of those, and really tough also to get into my fourth, but also very important value to me, consistency. The ability to have someone be the same person and have predictable interactions with them rather than them being able to go off the handle at all times, you not really knowing what they're going to be doing from one day to the next. That's a situation I lived through in my childhood where I had a parent who was abusive and he was truly unpredictable. And so for me, that level of unpredictability signals not safe. Like, this is an unsafe situation. This person is not who I should be with. And so consistency is also super important to me. And again, that was one of those things that this relationship was not able to provide me, an alignment with all of those values. I don't think that you need to have your personalities completely aligned, but I think your values being aligned is pretty important. I think also something about goals is very important because the things that I wanted from my life are not the same as the things he wanted from his life. We all have different drive systems and different levels of ambition. Some people are perfectly fine to date someone with no ambition because, what difference does it make to their relationship? For me, it makes quite a big difference because if you don't have a certain level of ambition and goals, I'm going to be spending a lot of my time chasing mine, and you're going to kind of be left out and left alone if you don't have your own to chase as well. I think it also kind of feeds into the idea of freedom and autonomy and independence as important values for me. You can't really be free if you don't have your own mindset, agency, goals, ambitions, dreams, etc., that are unrelated to the person you're with, right? And the third thing, which was super surprising, is that we always assume that having one dominant part of our makeup, temperament, personality, whatever you call it, is going to be enough to account for the differences. And in this case, they weren't, because I am a Black, queer, South African woman, and he was a white, very straight American man. And there were lots of aspects of my lived experience and my identity that he was unable to empathize with and unable to really see from my perspective. And that was very difficult for me because it was the power dynamics that play out in society in general and the privilege and oppression that plays out in society in general playing out in our home, which was unfortunate and unexpected because it's not as though he was a racist. It's not as though he was sexist. It's not as though he was xenophobic. But somehow, not understanding those things and having lived with a set of expectations about those things and how the world worked, and then having to be convinced about my lived experience, which for people who are diverse always involves somehow re-traumatizing yourself because until you have proved that this was sufficiently bad, people don't believe you. So, for example, in the workplace, in order to prove discrimination, you have to tell stories about every time you were discriminated against. And in this relationship, in order to prove some of my lived experiences as a Black woman, for example, with healthcare, it required me telling story after story after story because that anecdotal evidence was the only way that he would believe that that discrimination actually existed. And even then, he wasn't necessarily acknowledging that it existed at a systematic level. He was sort of saying, well, that person and that person and that institution were racist, but everyone in general isn't, which is a beautiful way to see the world, but honestly, it just isn't factually accurate. And that sense of not belonging with a person, of not feeling included by a person, of not feeling that there's sufficient understanding of equity in the relationship mattered a lot more to me than I thought it would. Because at the time, I think I was so caught up in this imaginary thing of neurodivergent people, or at the time, just people like me who are flaky or like, too fun or too adventurous or whatever strange labels I wanted to give myself. I bought into the narrative that we're useless at relationships. I bought into the narrative that I was kind of the problem and that someone who was being with me was putting up with my problem. It was really nice to meet someone who seemed to have the same kind of problems because it meant that neither of us really was going to be at fault and we could kind of take on the role of being an intimate sexual team, which is, of course, we know the key to having better sex and better relationships. But as it turned out, we were not both the problem. We had completely different problems, and our problems were actually had nothing to do with neurodivergency and everything to do with other aspects of our identity and lived experience, which was super surprising for me. Because I tended to think that this was the most important part of my relationship, simply because in the other relationships that I'd been in, my ability to wash the dishes, make the bed, remember birthdays, remember to stock the fridge, etc., had been a much bigger source of conflict than my lived experience as someone who is straight passing, right? So In a sense, it was a little bit like I was in a graduate level relationship when I'd only experienced an undergrad level relationship, if you understand what I mean. Like this was a different level that was required, partially because it was more functional, because it was fulfilling more of my needs than previous relationships had been, and because honestly, I really felt like I'd met my soulmate. And then to discover that my soulmate was like a bit of an asshole, still love him, but definitely, had his problems, was very difficult for me because it kind of implies that finding your soulmate isn't really enough. And it kind of implies that it's never going to be this perfect fit. And this idea of a perfect fit, the idea of if another neurodivergent person and I get together, we won't have any of these problems. I really wanted to hold on to that. And that just honestly wasn't true. But nonetheless, an interesting experience to see that it was possible to have a fully functioning neurodivergent relationship with clear communication, great sex, intellectual desires, the same kind of lifestyle that you want to lead, and to not feel like it failed just because it ended. I think that was a wonderful lesson for me to learn. And I hope that everybody has the opportunity to experience that. And in particular, to come to their own kind of moment of going, it's not on you to do all the work to make this work. You are not useless at relationships, probably exactly the opposite. You are not the problem and no one's doing you a favor nor exercising some sort of altruism by being with you. And most importantly, everything that I could say or everything that I have said might not resonate with you in any way. But that's because we're not all the same. And that's something to be celebrated, not something that's bad. So thank you again for joining Storytime. I hope you got something from that, and I'll see you next time. Bye.